This story begins when I was only 3 years old. I have memories that are hazy, but I still somewhat remember when this figure first appeared in my life. Being the youngest at the time, and the only daughter, my parents made sure that I had my own room. However, I never seemed to want to sleep in it. I wasn't able to speak properly yet. Since my babysitter only spoke English and my parents spoke Spanish, it caused some communication problems. One night I remember feeling like someone was watching me, and I thought that maybe it was one of my brothers checking in on me or trying to pull a prank. However, I suddenly felt very cold, and I looked towards my closet. And there it was, the tall, shadowy figure of a man. He didn't try to approach or talk to me, but I did feel very scared. I do remember running to my parents' room and sleeping as close as possible to my father. Ever since that night, that figure has always stayed with me until now. My family moved into a different home around the time I was 7, and that's where I met a little boy named Alex. It never occurred to me to think that it was strange to meet a boy in the backyard of my new house. There was no way he would have been able to sneak in, since our fence's gate latch was way too high for him to reach. We were best friends after the day we met. He was always with me wherever I went, even at school. I would always make room for him at the dinner table, my bed, the seat next to me in my parents' van whenever we would go somewhere, and even left some of my toys out for him. My parents did ask me one day to tell him to leave me alone and to get out of my life. I was super shocked, because he was a very nice boy, and even did his best to calm me down whenever the shadow figure would return and stand in my closet or my doorway. Eventually I did listen to my parents and asked Alex to leave. He did disappear for a very long time. I was very sad about this, as he was a part of my life until the age of 9. Now that I'm 24, I did bring Alex up into the conversation when we were at dinner. I asked my parents why they told me to let him go. My parents told me that they thought it was time for me to leave my imaginary friend behind and start making new friends with some of the kids in the neighborhood. I was even more baffled at this point. I told my parents that he wasn't imaginary. He was a real boy, and I was able to see him in the same way that I saw other people. He would even hold my hand sometimes. My parents were also baffled when I told them this, because they had never once saw Alex. However, they did admit to me that they would hear a little boy laughing in my room whenever I was away visiting relatives. I'm going to backtrack this story a bit to when I was 22, the day before I was going to catch a flight to visit my boyfriend in SoCal. I was in horrible pain and vomiting. It became so unbearable that I had to tell my mom to take me to the emergency room. After all the tests and ultrasound were done, the doctors concluded that it was my gallbladder. There was a moment that I was alone right before my emergency surgery. I know that I was kind of loopy from the morphine, but I remembered a woman appearing to me. I've seen this woman before, when I was 3, and again at the age of 8, and now for the 3rd time in the ER. She was so beautiful, but had a very sad look on her face every time I saw her. She spoke to me briefly for the first time and told me, "Everything is going to be fine, but I need you to promise me this. Take care of Alex." I nodded my head, and before I could say anything to her, she was gone. When I awoke from surgery, the doctors that were in charge of my case made it very clear that they were unsure how I was still alive. Blood tests showed that my infection was horrible. My white blood cell count was more than double the limit, and my gallbladder was ready to explode. They made it very clear to me to take my recovery very seriously, and to remain in the hospital until the antibiotics took their course. 4 days later, I was finally discharged. After I returned to my home, all the activity started again. I was hearing footsteps now, even when I was home alone. Doors would slam shut. Dishes would fall to the ground when no one was in the kitchen. My parents one day called my phone asking if I had returned early from going out with friends. I said no. Then my parents explained they were going to go check in my room because I kept hearing footsteps. I was horrified. I told my friends to take me home immediately. Luckily, my parents didn't find anything, and my room was unmolested. It was then that I had to confess to them that I had been seeing the shadow man. After so many years, I got used to it. He would never do anything to me. He would only stand in the doorway or the closet. He would also disappear from view whenever lights were turned on. One night I had a dream that explained who these three spirits were and how they were all related, and it actually made me feel sad. I saw things from a third-person perspective, as if I was the audience watching a movie or a play. The woman I saw in the ER was the first person I saw when the dream started. She was in the middle of giving birth, and from what I could see, the hospital staff were doing their best to calm her down and stop her from bleeding. She was only able to hold her son for a brief moment until her head fell back onto the pillow and lost grip of the baby. It was a boy. The woman died right then and there. Before the dream transitioned, I noticed that her arms had bruises on them, and she looked a bit malnourished. Now the dream went to a man. A tall, average-built man. He was sitting at a table drinking beer. It was obvious that he was drunk and had been drinking for some time, considering all the empty bottles around him. He stood up aggressively and threw a bottle against the wall and screamed. The dream transitioned to a small boy crouching on the floor in visible pain. He had bruises all over his arms. His shirt was torn in places, and you could see that there were marks in the open spots. The drunk man from the previous scene appeared to be beating on the boy. When the boy looked up at him and begged him to stop, I instantly recognized him. It was Alex. I ran immediately to defend him, and ended up being hit by the man and knocked the wind out of me. And that's when I wasn't in the scene anymore. I was seeing everything from a third-person view, and I saw Alex on the floor, dead. He wasn't moving. He wasn't bleeding either, but I could see he had a visible look of pain on his face. I tried to go to him and hold him, but I couldn't. I was now seeing more than one scene. It was the drunk man again. He was walking somewhere while drinking a beer. He didn't look like he was doing too well either. It was clear his health had severely declined. He slipped and fell into a pile of garbage somewhere in the street, and no one minded him. He died there, either from the cold weather or from his failing health. When I woke up from that horrible nightmare, the first thing I did was check my back. In the mirror, I saw a giant red mark. It was on the spot where I had taken the hit. It hurt so badly that I was unable to lay on that side for a few days. I was able to put things into perspective and understand that the shadow man this whole time was Alex's father. The woman I saw at the ER was his mom. I realized at the times that she had come into my life, a disaster occurred. I saw her the first time at the age of 3. My mom and brothers were out shopping, and I was left home alone with my dad, who was napping. She appeared the first time and told me to go wake my dad up. When I stepped into the hallway, I remembered a horrible smell. I ran to go wake my dad up, and when we went out the front door, the kitchen was already on fire. The second time I saw her, I was 8. My mom and I got into a car accident. We had been rear-ended, and somehow, we weren't pushed hard enough to go into oncoming traffic, just barely missing a huge trailer that would have smashed into us, probably killing us both. Then the last time right before surgery, something tells me that she sacrificed herself for me because I haven't seen her since, and the doctors were astonished that I was still alive. Before I moved out in July, I asked the shadow man to leave my family alone and to not follow me. I also told him to leave Alex alone. Unfortunately, after I left, the presence got stronger. My younger sister told me that she felt a hand on her back and was having a hard time breathing because of it and wasn't able to move. When I went to go visit my family last year in September, My dad confessed to me that he was not doing well. He explained that his heart rate was going faster than normal, and he also believes that his blood pressure was way too high. He said that this all started when I came back. He said that he thought he saw me in the kitchen and tried to strike up a conversation, but I wasn't responding. He then said that my apparition turned into a shadow figure. I was furious when he told me this. The shadow man had been tormenting my family the entire time I was away. I went to visit my family again for my birthday, and this time I brought my boyfriend with me. My sister brought up how she had been seeing someone in my room again, and that she still had trouble breathing sometimes at night. Later that night, me and my boyfriend went to bed. I heard someone whispering in my ear to wake up because it was an emergency. When I woke up, I was met with the scariest situation possible. My boyfriend was struggling to breathe. He kept repeating,
No, stop! You're choking me!
I could tell that he didn't have much time left. I tried to wake him up, but he wasn't budging. I turned on the light and started shaking my boyfriend harder. And he finally opened his eyes and tried to take a deep breath in. It was horrible. His lips were almost a bluish purple. He was wheezing and coughing badly. He immediately asked me why I was choking him, and I told him I had no idea what he was talking about. I explained to him that I was trying to wake him up this entire time. I gave him one of my inhalers, and after some time he was able to breathe again. After that, I was too scared to turn off the light. No further incidents happened that night. I told my parents about it the next morning and apologized for any yelling they might have heard during the night. They said they heard nothing, and then told me that something has to be done to get rid of these spirits. We had tried something like this once before. We had brought in a member of the church who was close with our priest. From the moment she arrived, she had this awful cough that didn't seem to go away the entire time she was there. After drinking water, we could hear my bedroom door being shook pretty hard. After she was done blessing our home, I walked her to her vehicle, and her cough instantly stopped. I haven't been able to get in touch with her ever since. At the time of writing this, I'm 24, and I still possess a strong connection to spirits. I rarely see them now, but I can definitely still feel their presence. I usually have dreams that warn me or explain things to me. Luckily, I'm always able to recall my dreams in vivid detail. I do write them down to refer back to them sometimes. I believe that it was fate that me and my boyfriend found each other, because he can see spirits in the same way that I can. Ever since he was attacked in his sleep at my parents' house, he definitely believes me when I tell him to be careful. This story happened about 5 or 6 years ago, when I was in my early 20s. I had driven back to the small, rural mountain town that I grew up in. I had since moved about an hour away, closer to the city, but was back in town on this particular night for dinner with an old friend. After dinner, I was preparing to make the drive back home. The nostalgia was getting to me, as the small town I grew up in really hadn't changed much over the years, and I felt like driving around for a little while. It was autumn, and there was still some daylight left. There was this one particular gated community in town that had expensive homes at the top of a small mountain. I had never been up there. That's because the giant black iron gates at the single entrance was always closed and locked. It was the kind of place that was entirely made up of vacation and rental homes. Because of their location way up in the mountain, nobody would want to actually live there. So most of the time, it was a ghost town up there, or so I had been told. However, as I drove past this time, for some reason, the gates to the community were open. I had never seen them opened in my life, so you bet your ass I drove inside. I began my drive to the top of the mountain. I've always heard that there was a lake at the very top, and I wanted to see it for myself. After about a 15-minute drive up the winding roads, with a few nice houses scattered here and there, I finally got to the top. There was indeed a lake. It was a small man-made lake surrounded by a sandy beach wrapping around the water. It was located in the middle of a grassy field. This whole area was bordered by a ring of large houses. Every single house looked completely empty because, as I said before, they were all vacation properties and were usually empty during the weeks. I hadn't seen a single car since I entered, so I decided to park my car at the edge of the field and walk down to the lake. The sun was starting to go down at this point, and it was so peaceful, and yet an eerie silence lingered. It was a disturbing kind of silence, the kind that sets you on edge just before something terrible happens to you. I don't think I've ever felt so much emptiness in my life, as if I was 100% positive there was no other humans or animals for miles. It didn't seem like a normal neighborhood. It felt totally deserted and devoid of life. It had rained earlier that day, so when I got to the small beach, it was still slightly wet and compacted. I clearly remember as I started walking on the beach that I was oddly satisfied by how perfect my footprints were. You could see every detail about my foot crystal clear in the sand. Now it's important to note that from my vantage point, I could see the entire lake, beach, and field, and all of the nearby houses. My car was within my line of vision directly behind me. In other words, if anyone was there with me, there would have been nowhere for them to hide. No trees, rocks, or objects to obscure them. I then walked to the opposite side of the lake, which took no more than a minute or two. It was dark by now, and it was starting to get cold, and the eerie silence somehow became more apparent, not so much as a bird chirping. I took a second to enjoy the peace and tranquility. I then decided to walk back towards my car. As I was walking back, I noticed something out of place, something that made my skin crawl. Alongside my footprints were now a second pair of footprints. They were the footprints of a small child. I would say no older than maybe 2 or 3, based on the size of the foot. The prints were as clear as day, and I could clearly decipher all 5 toes. For a moment, I was confused, because I was 100% sure that they had not been there when I arrived. I was watching my footprints the entire time as I walked down the beach, and I definitely would have noticed them if they had been there. Something else that seemed odd was that these tracks just appeared in the middle of my own, and they didn't seem to come from anywhere. So I tried to be logical at first. I assumed that maybe there was a small child out here who wasn't wearing shoes, and perhaps they got lost. So I looked around and called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" But no one responded. I decided to follow these footprints to see where they led to. They seemed to be going towards my car anyway. I didn't have to follow them for very long. They suddenly made a sharp turn to the left and went straight into the water. I stared confused and dumbfounded for a second, and briefly scanned the surface of the lake to make sure there was nobody actually in there. After only a few seconds of trying to rationalize the situation, I realized that there was absolutely nothing logical about any of this. This was some freaky shit. I suddenly began feeling very uncomfortable. I no longer felt like I was alone. I very briskly walked back to my car and hightailed it out of there. I've never been back there since, and I've never seen those iron gates left open again. I haven't told many people about this story, because let's be honest, it sounds completely made up. I do believe and follow God. I believe in angels and demons, and I'm not sure what happened at that lake, but it does make for an interesting story. Thanks for listening.
There is an old state maximum security prison located in Moundsville, West Virginia. This prison has a long and violent history. Prisoners have been murdered in their cells by other inmates during a massive riot, and many were put to death in the electric chair that was built by an inmate from that facility, nicknamed Old Sparky. The prison has been abandoned for many years. However, you can still tour it, and if you're brave enough, You can even spend the night there. This story takes place during my tour of the old facility while I was a corrections officer with the state of West Virginia. Once we had received our initial briefing about the facility, we were allowed to tour it on our own and pretty much go wherever we wanted, even places that were inaccessible to the public. While touring the facility, I was in a section of the prison known as the Sugar Shack, supposedly where some of the worst offenders were housed. I was the only person in this block of the prison at the time, and while I was up on the 3rd tier, inspecting some of the old cells, when I heard something from the lower levels. It sounded like cell doors slamming shut. Now, this wouldn't have come as much of a surprise to me if it weren't for the fact that all the doors had closed at once, which is what they are supposed to do, but they are controlled by a lever from a central location which I could see from my vantage point, and no one was there, and the lever was still in the up position. Taking that as a cue to leave, I left that section of the prison and made my way down to the basement level, the location of the hole. They say that this section of the prison drove many of the inmates mad. I could feel the tension in the air as soon as I entered this place. I kept having the feelings of someone following me, and as I got closer to the hole, a feeling of dread and despair almost overwhelmed me. I kept my composure and made my way deeper into the basement. I then caught a glimpse of a dark figure moving just off in the shadows from right to left. The path that the apparition took should have brought it into the light. What little there even was. But even so, as soon as it emerged from the darkness, it seemed to vanish into thin air. That was enough for me. Time to leave. The rest of the tour went smoothly with no other strange occurrences. Just a sense of foreboding in certain areas. This has all led me to believe that something is still behind the walls of that old prison that may never be able to leave. I'm currently traveling out of the country, but as soon as I get back stateside, I'm going to do an all-night ghost hunt of this facility. Hopefully, I'll make it out alive.
Hey, what's going on guys? Uncle Unit here, and I hope you enjoyed today's video. I'm going to give a special thanks to WolfsCampFire for joining me. I think he's a very good storyteller, and I highly recommend that you go check out his videos. A link to his channel will be in the description and at the end of this video. And if you guys have a story of your own that you want me to read on this channel, be sure to send it to the email that you see on screen now. And on that note, I hope you guys have a great weekend. And until next time, never forget,
there's always a